Atlanta Press Club Debates 2008, the Democratic race for the 8th Congressional District, is brought to you from Georgia Public Broadcasting. Here's the moderator for today's debate.
Hello, I'm Josephine Bennett, news spot reporter for GPB's radio station, WMUM in Macon. Welcome to our 2008 election campaign debates, originating from the studios of GPB. Today's debate is organized by the Atlanta Press Club. Now let's meet the Democratic candidates facing each other in Georgia's 8th Congressional District primary election. They are, in alphabetical order, Jim Marshall, who declined the Atlanta Press Club's invitation. The debate will proceed with an empty podium. Jim Marshall is serving his third term in the 8th Congressional District. He sits on the House Armed Services, Financial Services, and Agriculture Committees. And Robert Nowak, who is an educator in Bibb County and the past recipient of the Teacher of the Year Award. Here is the format for tonight's debate. In the first round, the candidate will answer a question from our three panelists. In the second round, the candidate will ask one question of his absent opponent. And in the third round, the panelists will continue questioning the candidate. Finally, the candidate will have 30 seconds to make a closing statement. Before we get started, let's meet our three panelists selected by the Atlanta Press Club. First, we have Walter Jones, Atlanta Bureau Chief for Morris News Service. Next is Travis Fain, political reporter for the Macon Telegraph. And our third panelist is John Hollis, a reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Now, let's get started with the debate. In the first round, the candidate will be asked a question by each panelist. The candidate has 60 seconds to answer each question. The first question comes from Walter Jones.
Mr. Nowak, thank you for participating in the debate. I'd like to ask you, though, when looking at campaign contributions and the finances, currently you're listing only $1,000 on hand. How serious a campaign can you mount with that little amount of money?
I think that actually it's been a benefit to me, because what it's forced me to do is to go meet the people on the street. I don't talk at people through ads and through newspapers. I actually get out there and shake their hands and see what their problems are. Obviously, any kind of advertising would be nice to have. So in answer to the question, further, I think the base is growing, actually, as I've gotten out there and met people. If I had $300,000, of course, it would be much easier. So, and I have not even attempted for the past 4 or 5 months to raise money, so it's not a lack of getting funds, it's a lack I just haven't tried to get funds, actually.
Travis Fain, you may ask your question for Robert Nowak.
Mr. Nowak, just tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background, and about how you came to decide to run for Congress.
My background, it's hard to distill 60 years in a short answer. A lot of experiences, education, business, both retail, international business, computers. I did the database for the U.S. Air Force, the first one in Dhahran. So I say I have quite a varied experience both in work and places lived. So that, I think, gives me an advantage over many congressional candidates. I decided to run because basically I think that Mr. Marshall, well, he says it himself, he will not choose between, he will not endorse Obama or endorse McCain. I think personally he's closer to McCain in terms of politics, and I'd say I'm closer to Obama in terms of politics. And I think what the Democrats need is somebody close to Obama to be running from that district.
John Hollis, it's your turn to ask Robert Nowak a question.
Mr. Nowak, educational reform is always a hot-button issue, particularly in an election year, but especially when we talk about No Child Left Behind. What do you think of that act in its current form, and why?
Well, I've taught under it, and I think that, in a sense, that it was a good idea gone bad. It's based on a faulty premise. That's the first thing. It's based on the fact they're trying to get everybody to perform at grade level by 2012. Well, that's like asking everybody in the country to make two foul throws in basketball out of 10. Not everybody's going to be able to do it. You either water down the the assessment, make the grades so for passing so low, or you just start saying we aren't going to test these people. So I think it really has to be rewritten. What the strength of it is that it made people concentrate on certain parts of the population that had been left aside, like special ed, and in certain cases, troublemakers, for instance. So that's a good thing. Too much testing, too much assessment and testing, and that's just not even good practice yet. So, I mean, it has to be rewritten. Good idea, good intentions, has to be rewritten.
That concludes round one. It is now time for the candidate to ask one question for his absent opponent. You have 15 seconds for the question and 30 seconds for a rebuttal. Please go ahead, Mr. Nowak.
Mr. Marshall, in the recent vote, health care for children, the S-chip, known as the S-chip, you were the sole Democrat to vote against the bill. Please, can you explain your vote?
Rebuttal.
Well, needless to say, I disagree, and I think his answer shows callous regard to the American family, problems of the American family. I have seen children whose parents made too much to qualify for health insurance, Medicaid, made too little to buy the medication needed. In this particular case, the person's academic success was ruined. Hundreds of thousands of people, children in this state, are without health insurance. I think they deserve it. We must invest in our children.
That concludes our second round of questioning. For our third round, we return to our panel of journalists. The candidate will be allowed 1 minute to respond to each question. We begin this round with a question from Walter Jones.
Mr. Nowak, the economy has now surpassed the war and become one of the top issues on the minds of voters. How would you stimulate the economy, both in the short term and in the long run?
I would first of all start some job programs, and in particular, working on the infrastructure, roads, railroads, fast trains, and ports. That has to be done there anyway. Also, I would look at the international picture. We've sent a lot of our jobs overseas. So I would review tax breaks for corporations who move overseas and review tariffs. And both those are both short-term and long-term. It is true that jobs are an issue because people are losing their houses. People are losing, they don't have health insurance. They can't pay for gas these days. So the stimulus has to provide jobs for people. That's what has to be done. That's how I do it.
Now Travis Fain will ask a question.
Can you describe your philosophy of taxation for the viewers?
I think one of the serious problems in the country these days is the growing gap between the rich and the poor. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the lower 90% had 65% of the wealth. Now they have 51% of the wealth. That's worse than the time it was during the Depression years, Hoover's time. I think it's very important to keep the difference from not getting too great. I'm a firm believer in progressive taxation, which means that the more money you make, the more heavily you're taxed. Simple as that.
John Hollis, it's your turn to ask a question.
Well, Mr. Nowak, my mom is a retired school teacher as well, so she'd probably appreciate, I'm going to kind of harp on education as well. There's a big controversy statewide about the recent release of the CRCT scores. Statewide, scores were down, particularly in math and science. What do you see as the problem in Georgia's sagging test scores all around in the low national rankings, and how can these things be addressed and improved?
Well, I'd address it first of all by expanding the Head Start program, or programs such as that, preschool. That sets me apart from my opponent, for instance, who votes against it. It has been proven that that enhances educational success. So that's the first thing I'd start to do. CRCTs, the test itself, I'm for a national test, so we compare all states across the board. I have worked in schools that where people did where the science teacher was told not to teach science for a while because you're just stressing math and English, things like that. So I think preschool is one thing. I think we have to, again, rewrite No Child Left Behind. That takes pressure off the teachers. I think we have to fund teaching education programs, especially mentor programs for people to mentor the new teachers coming in. That's what I would do. Those three things I think would be very important, but particularly preschool.
Walter Jones, go ahead and ask another question.
Well, if John's focusing on education for his mother, I'm focusing on pocketbooks.
Okay, good.
One of the next issues is gas prices,
yes.
Of course. So what do you do on that?
I think what you said before, I think that's a long-term answer. I mean, one of the problems I see with Congress is that they get a problem and they try to solve it overnight. I mean, something like, oh, take the tax off it, or, you know, $300 million for a, car or something like that, which I think is just crazy. I think that Congress has to sit down, very hard for them to do, for 6, 7 months, say, what are our energy needs going to be 15 years, 30 years down? How are we going to supply that? Renewable energies, which ones? Where do we get them from? How are they going to be used? And then it comes to, of course, the gasoline question. Well, that would be a component of that, of course, and we have to see what we have to have. But we always have to think about the fact that we have to stop burning fuels. We have to do that. And so the environmental component will always be part of that and should be part of that. Can't be forgotten.
Travis Fain, go ahead and ask another question.
You've spent some time in the Middle East. I'm wondering what your strategy would be in Iraq.
Yes. A bad war, a moral war, in my opinion. We got in there by lies and deceit. This is what I would try. Since I've lived there, I know that the Arabs want to work on their problems by themselves. I would go to the Iraqis and say, look, we're going to start pulling our troops out. Now, tell us what you need from us. And they'll say, well, we might need A, B, and C. And we'll say, well, we'll give you A and B. The rest you do by yourself. And it's kind of a give and take and give and take, but it puts it in their court. Where we're going now, we might be there for 100 years, and I think that would be a disaster. I think it's a disaster now. So, but that's what I would do. I'd say I'd put it in their court and force their hand a bit.
John Hollis, go ahead. We have time for another question from you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Nowak, how do you believe your experience as an educator would translate as a lawmaker?
Oh, I think my experience is actually not only as an educator, but all through my life. As an educator, just to work on problems with people. I mean, I was a teacher of the year, and that's because I worked well with other members of the faculty in cooperation with them. I think my experience in a teacher, well, I've taught in Ireland, I've taught in Saudi Arabia, actually, I've taught in this country. I know a lot of different cultures, and I think that gives me a great advantage over a lot of congressmen, and especially in dealing with international affairs. And it's a question of just solving a problem. When you have a problem in class, like in a lot of works, you say, well, here's the problem. What do I have to do to get to the answer, and how do we assess it when we're done? And that's what any intelligent person would do, and I think that would be fine for Congress also.
Walter Jones, go ahead, ask another question.
Just got to ask, as you're recounting your resume and how you've taught in all these different places and had all these different careers, I got to ask, can't you keep a job?
Well, that's a good question. Well, I can keep a job. My first part of my life when I was in music, I actually just worked up the ladder. And then I said, I want something different. So I went to Saudi Arabia, and I could have had a job. I could have kept a job in Northern Ireland. I was offered a job in Northern Ireland. But I tend to be somebody who just likes to move around and change and get different experiences. So I've never been fired, if that's what you mean. I've never been fired. So it's not a question. It's a question, always been a question of choice, of a widening of my experience. And that's also why I've traveled to other countries and lived in other countries, just to broaden the experience.
Well, if I could follow up, if you won, would you stay in Congress for long?
Well, I've basically been in teaching. You say I've changed jobs, but I've been in teaching for, let's say, 25 years, basically, even though I have the other thing on my resume. And, of course, it's always hard to say, but and I don't know, God grant me a longer life. But I would try to do the best I could. I mean, I don't peer into the future like that. But I wouldn't just go and say, oh, I've had enough and get out like that. I think that would be very unfair to the electorate.
Travis Vane, go ahead and ask another question.
You've talked about S-chip. I'm wondering, beyond just children's health care, are you in favor of universal health care?
I do think we have to do something. Again, I think a lot of the problems come from the fact that people are just losing their good-paying jobs, the manufacturing jobs. And so I am. I'm not sure about which one I'd choose, whether the single payer or the employee payer. What I'd like to see is basically a panel where people have one side, people have another side, and they talk, and then I could make some decisions, because it's such a huge decision, universal health care, and it would change the fabric of our health care in this society so much that I have to do some further study. But yes, I think everybody deserves health care in this country.
John Hollis, we have time for one more question.
Mr. Nowak, what was your view of last week's Supreme Court decision striking down the D.C. gun ban?
Oh, I think they were correct. I do think they were correct. I think it's just a constitutional right to have guns, and I think from what I've read, what they said, it was a right to have guns in your house. I think that's what they limited it to. I'm not sure of that. So I think they made the correct decision. I don't know how that'll affect the crime rate and the killing, but I think they made the right decision.
We have no more time for questions. Now, Robert Nowak, Democratic candidate for the 8th Congressional District, will have 30 seconds for a closing statement. I'd like to remind our viewers that Jim Marshall declined our invitation to debate. Please go ahead, Mr. Nowak.
What concerns me most in this country today is the growing inequality of wealth. It's like people at one time sat at a table. Some people, of course, had maybe their steak. Some people had their hamburger. But the table's been tilted. All the food is going down to one side. People up here are left without jobs, without houses, without health care, without all kinds of benefits. And the straw that broke the camel's back, of course, is gas prices. And I would like to do, with your vote, change that. So bring it back down here, more equality.
That concludes our debate. Please remember to vote at the primary elections on Tuesday, July 15th. Our thanks to the candidate and to our panel of journalists. We'd also like to thank the Atlanta Press Club for arranging tonight's debate. For more information about the Atlanta Press Club, you may visit www.atlantapressclub.org. The debates that air on Georgia Public Broadcasting will be archived on the Press Club's website. I'm Josephine Bennett. Thanks for joining us for this primary election debate.
This program was funded in part by a grant from the late Tom Watson Brown and by supporters of Georgia Public Broadcasting. Thank you.